I still remember the exact moment I realized my daughter had erased me from her life. It wasn't dramatic. There was no phone call, no argument, no slammed door. It happened quietly, almost politely, the way the deepest betrayals often do. I was standing in the grocery store, holding my phone, staring at a name I didn't recognize. A stranger's name, but the number belonged to my daughter. At first I thought it was a glitch. Phones update, apps change, names reset. I told myself it was nothing, but my hands were shaking as I clicked on her profile. The photo was different. The name was different. Everything that once connected her to me was gone. My heart started pounding as if my body understood the truth before my mind could accept it. My daughter had changed her name, and she hadn't told me. That might not sound like much to some people. Names change all the time. People grow, evolve, reinvent themselves. But this wasn't about marriage. This wasn't about culture or career or personal growth. This was something else. This was erasure, the deliberate removal of identity, the quiet decision to sever a bond that had taken a lifetime to build. I stood there between the cereal aisle and the frozen foods, feeling like the ground beneath me had shifted. I wanted to call her immediately, but fear stopped me. Fear of what I might hear. Fear of what I already knew. When I finally got home, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, staring at nothing. The house was quiet, too quiet. It used to be filled with her voice, her laughter, her footsteps running down the hallway. Now it felt like a museum of memories that no longer belonged to anyone but me. I replayed every moment of her childhood in my mind, searching for the exact point where everything went wrong. I remembered holding her for the first time, her tiny fingers curling around mine as if she was afraid to let go. I remembered staying up all night when she was sick, whispering reassurances even when I was exhausted and scared. I remembered cheering at school events, saving drawings, forgiving slammed doors and teenage anger because I believed love was stronger than anything. I never imagined that one day she would decide that I no longer deserved a place in her identity. The days that followed were filled with confusion and quiet panic. I tried calling her. It rang, then went to voicemail. I sent messages, careful ones, gentle ones. I saw your new name. I hope you're okay. No response. Hours turned into days. Days turned into weeks. That silence was louder than any argument we had ever had. Friends tried to reassure me. She's just finding herself. It's probably nothing personal. Give her space. But space is a luxury you can afford when you know someone will come back. When you don't, space feels like abandonment stretching endlessly into the future. I began questioning myself in ways I never had before. Had I been too strict, too lenient, too emotional, not emotional enough? I replayed every disagreement, every moment where I might have said the wrong thing, every time I tried to guide her instead of agreeing with her. I wondered if love, when expressed imperfectly, could turn into something unforgivable. One night, unable to sleep, I searched her new name online. I don't know what I expected to find. Answers, maybe, or reassurance. What I found instead felt like another knife twisting in my chest. Her social media accounts were public now, but I was not present in them. No photos, no mentions, no references. It was as if I had never existed. She had rewritten her story, and I was no longer part of it. I noticed something else too. She spoke about chosen family and starting fresh. Words that sound empowering until you realize what they imply. To start fresh, something must be left behind. And I was what she had chosen to leave. I wanted to be angry. I felt like I deserved to be. But anger never came the way I expected. Instead, there was grief. A deep, hollow grief that settled into my chest and refused to leave. It felt like mourning someone who was still alive, someone who had chosen to disappear. I thought about reaching out to relatives, asking if they knew what was happening. But pride stopped me. Shame too. How do you explain that your own child has erased you without sounding like a failure? As weeks passed, I noticed changes in myself. I stopped checking my phone as often. I avoided places where parents talked about their children. I smiled less, slept poorly, ate because I had to, not because I wanted to. The world kept moving, but I felt stuck in the moment I first saw that unfamiliar name on my screen. One afternoon, a letter arrived. My hands trembled as I opened it, hoping, no, begging, that it was from her. It wasn't. It was addressed to her, under her new name, at my address. I stared at the envelope for a long time. The universe had a cruel sense of timing. Even the mail seemed determined to remind me that I had been replaced, that the version of my daughter I knew was gone, living under a name that did not include me. I didn't open the letter. I couldn't. Instead, I placed it on the table and sat down, feeling something shift inside me. This wasn't just about a name anymore. This was about control, about identity, about the power to decide who matters and who doesn't. That night, I finally allowed myself to cry, not quietly, not politely. I cried the way you cry when something fundamental breaks, when love doesn't disappear but has nowhere to go, when the person you gave everything to decides that you no longer fit into their life. But even through the tears, a question kept forming in my mind, slow and persistent. How does a daughter reach a point where erasing her mother feels like freedom? I didn't have the answer yet, but I knew one thing with painful clarity. This story was far from over. Because names can be changed, histories can be edited, but truth has a way of resurfacing, often when least expected. And somewhere deep inside me, beneath the grief and confusion, something else was beginning to grow. Not anger, not revenge, but awareness. A quiet understanding that one day she might realize that erasing me did not erase what I gave her. And when that day came, the question would no longer be whether she had room for me in her life. It would be whether I still had room for her. After that night of crying until my chest ached, I didn't suddenly feel better. People talk about release as if tears wash pain away. They don't. They only make space for it to settle differently. The grief didn't leave me. It simply changed shape. It became quieter, heavier, more constant, like a low ache you learn to live with because resisting it only makes it worse. The next morning, I woke up early, not because I was rested, but because sleep no longer wanted me. I sat at the edge of the bed and stared at the wall, replaying moments I had ignored for years, signs I had brushed aside, conversations I had minimized, boundaries I hadn't realized were being tested until they were already gone. My daughter hadn't erased me overnight. That truth was hard to accept, but undeniable. The erasure had started long before the name change. I just hadn't recognized it for what it was. I remembered the first time she corrected me in public, not gently but sharply, the way her tone shifted, how she looked embarrassed by me. At the time, I told myself it was normal. Young adults want independence. They push away. It's part of growing up. I smiled, apologized, and swallowed the sting because that's what mothers do. We absorb discomfort so our children don't have to. Then there were the conversations that stopped happening. She used to call me about everything, small things, big things, what she was cooking, who she was seeing, what scared her, what excited her. Over time, those calls became shorter, then less frequent, then replaced by texts, then replaced by silence punctuated only by updates she chose to share. When I asked how she was doing, she'd say, "Fine," and change the subject. When I offered advice, she'd sigh, as if my concern were an inconvenience rather than love. I started editing myself without realizing it, choosing my words carefully, avoiding certain topics, shrinking my presence to fit into whatever space she allowed me. I didn't notice I was disappearing until I was almost gone. I remembered the first time she introduced me without calling me her mother. She used my first name instead. People laughed it off, said it was modern, casual. I laughed too, even though something inside me tightened. A mother notices these things. We feel shifts before we understand them. I asked her about it later, gently. She rolled her eyes and said I was overthinking. "It's not a big deal," she said, and because I didn't want to be the kind of parent who clings or smothers, I let it go. But letting things go doesn't make them disappear. It only delays the moment you have to face them. I thought about how she used to talk about her childhood online. She framed herself as someone who had survived rather than been loved. She spoke in general terms, vague but pointed. Anyone reading would assume she had been raised in hardship, maybe even neglect. Each time I saw those posts, my stomach twisted. I wanted to defend myself, to correct the narrative, to say that's not how it was. But I stayed silent, afraid that speaking up would push her further away. I told myself she was processing things in her own way, that everyone rewrites their past at some point, that she'd come back to the truth eventually. I didn't realize that silence can sometimes sound like agreement. As the weeks passed after discovering the name change, I became hyper-aware of my absence in her life. I noticed how holidays went by without invitations, how milestones were announced publicly before I heard about them, if I heard about them at all. I wasn't excluded loudly. I was excluded efficiently. One day, I ran into someone who knew her. They asked casually how my daughter was doing. They used her new name. I froze. My smile felt stiff, unnatural. I nodded and answered politely, then excused myself as quickly as I could. I went home and sat down, overwhelmed by a realization that hurt more than anything else so far. Other people knew her new identity before I did. That meant the decision hadn't been impulsive. It had been planned, shared, normalized, while I was still holding on to the version of her who used to call me Mom without hesitation. I stopped trying to contact her after that. Not out of pride, but out of self-preservation. Every unanswered message chipped away at me. Every ring that went to voicemail made me feel smaller. I needed distance to breathe, even if that distance was forced. In that quiet, memories surfaced that I had buried under years of responsibility and routine. Times when I had put her needs above my own without question. Times when I had stayed in situations that drained me because I believed stability mattered more than happiness. I wondered if, in trying so hard to give her everything, I had taught her that I was disposable. That thought haunted me. One evening I found an old photo album while cleaning, page after page of her growing up, first steps, first day of school, birthday cakes I stayed up late making, costumes I sewed by hand. There I was in the background of every picture, smiling, tired, present. I touched the photos like they might disappear if I didn't. I whispered her old name aloud just to hear it again. It felt strange in my mouth, like speaking a language no one else remembered. I realized then that her name change wasn't just about identity, it was about control, about choosing a narrative where she could exist without obligation, without history, without the weight of the person who raised her. And maybe, in her mind, that made her feel free, but freedom built on erasure always demands a price. Sometimes the person who pays it isn't the one who chooses it. That night, for the first time since everything began, I stopped asking what I had done wrong. Instead, I asked a different question. What kind of world teaches a child that cutting off a parent is empowerment rather than tragedy? I didn't know the answer yet, but I knew this much. I had spent years centering my life around her. Now, whether I wanted to or not, I was being forced to center it around myself, and that shift, uncomfortable as it was, would change everything. There was no dramatic confrontation, no explosive argument where everything came out at once, no final phone call where voices were raised and truths were spoken. That was one of the hardest parts to accept. The distance between us didn't arrive with noise. It arrived with quiet decisions made without me. I kept replaying conversations in my mind, searching for the moment where I could have said something differently, where I could have stopped the drift before it became a disappearance. But every memory ended the same way, with me choosing peace over conflict, silence over insistence, love over being right. And somehow that choice had rewritten me. I began to hear fragments of stories about myself through other people. Nothing direct, nothing confrontational, just subtle shifts in how they spoke to me, the careful tone, the hesitant pauses, the way some avoided my eyes when my daughter's name came up. One person mentioned, casually, that my daughter had been through a lot growing up. Another said she was healing. Another told me how brave she was for setting boundaries. Every word landed like a small cut, not because I denied she had struggles, but because I was being erased from the context of love and effort and replaced with implication. I realized then that I wasn't just absent from her life. I was being edited out of her story. In her version, I was no longer a mother who tried her best. I was an obstacle she had overcome, a shadow she had stepped out of, a chapter she had closed without explanation, and the worst part was that I wasn't given the chance to respond. There is a particular kind of pain that comes from being judged without being heard, from being reduced to a symbol rather than seen as a human being. I had become a concept in her narrative, not a person with flaws and love and history. I wondered when it started, when she first decided that distancing herself wasn't enough, when she decided that redefining herself required redefining me too. I thought about the people around her, the friends who nodded along, the communities that praised her for choosing herself, the language that framed separation as strength and distance as growth. No one asked about me. No one wondered what it feels like to be left behind after building your life around someone else. Pain travels in one direction when the story is only told from one side. I tried once more to reach out, not to argue, not to defend myself, just to understand. I wrote a message that took me hours to compose. I reread it again and again, stripping away anything that sounded like accusation. I told her I loved her, that I was confused, that I wanted to listen. I stared at the screen before sending it, my thumb hovering over the button like it weighed 100 pounds. When I finally sent it, the silence that followed was worse than rejection. No response, no acknowledgement, just emptiness. Days passed, then weeks. I checked her social media less often after that. Every post felt like proof that she was thriving without me, smiling, traveling, surrounded by people who knew her only as she presented herself now. There was no space for me in those images, no room for the past, no evidence that I had ever mattered. I began questioning my own memories, wondering if I had imagined the closeness we once shared. If love could be erased so cleanly, maybe it hadn't been as real as I thought. But then something small would remind me, a song she used to love, a phrase she picked up from me, a habit she had inherited without realizing it. Proof that no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't completely undo where she came from. I started to understand something uncomfortable. Her name change wasn't just about who she wanted to be, it was about who she didn't want to be connected to. And in separating herself from me, she was also separating herself from the parts of her story that felt messy, complicated, and unresolved. It is easier to start over when you don't have to carry anyone with you. I thought about how the world responds to estranged children, with empathy, with validation, with applause for courage. But estranged parents are treated differently. We are expected to reflect quietly, accept blame gracefully, and disappear without protest. Our grief is inconvenient. Our questions are intrusive. There is no space for a parent's heartbreak in a culture that celebrates cutting ties as self-care. Some nights I imagined her future, milestones I wouldn't witness, decisions I wouldn't be asked about, a life continuing without my presence. And I wondered if she ever thought about the cost. Not to herself, but to me. Did she ever hesitate? Did she ever miss me and push the thought away? Or had she trained herself to believe that missing me was weakness? I stopped blaming myself for everything. Not because I believed I was perfect, but because perfection was never the requirement for love. Presence was, and I had been present, imperfect, yes, human, absolutely. But there. One evening, while sorting through old letters, I found a card she had written me years ago. In it, she thanked me for always being there, even when she didn't make it easy. She wrote that she knew she wasn't always kind, but she never doubted my love. I sat there for a long time, holding that card, letting the words sink in. She had known once. She had felt it once. That meant the erasure wasn't because love had been absent. It was because love had become inconvenient. And that realization didn't bring peace, but it brought clarity. Because clarity is the beginning of something else. Not reconciliation, not forgiveness yet, but understanding. And understanding is where the story truly starts to turn. At some point, waiting becomes a kind of self-betrayal. I didn't realize when that shift happened, only that one day I noticed how much of my life was still arranged around her absence. My schedule, my thoughts, my sense of time. I was living in the space she had left behind, hoping she might return and find everything exactly as it was. That hope was exhausting. I began to notice how often I measured myself against an invisible standard. Was I remorseful enough, understanding enough, quiet enough? As if my behavior now could retroactively earn me a place in her life. I was performing acceptance instead of practicing healing. People told me to move on, to focus on myself, to find peace. Those words sound simple until you realize they require you to let go of the version of yourself that existed as someone's parent in an active way, letting go of daily concern, of shared context, of knowing where your child is and whether they are okay. I wasn't just losing her, I was losing who I had been for decades. I started reading about estrangement, trying to understand the language people use to describe it. I noticed patterns, stories that sounded eerily familiar, parents who were labeled controlling simply for being concerned, mothers who were described as toxic for wanting closeness, fathers who were dismissed as emotionally unavailable without any curiosity about what they carried. The narratives were always clean, simple. One person liberated, one person left behind. Real life is messier than that. I realized how often the idea of a chosen family was used as both a shield and a weapon against unresolved pain, a weapon against the people who had known you before you learned how to curate yourself. Chosen families don't see your childhood mistakes. They don't remember your worst days. They only know the version you introduce. There is comfort in that, but there is also a kind of dishonesty. I wondered if my daughter felt safer in spaces where she didn't have to answer questions about her past, where no one remembered her crying at night or struggling or needing reassurance, where she could exist without being reminded that she once depended on someone else. Dependence is something we are taught to outgrow. Gratitude, unfortunately, is not taught with the same urgency. I stopped checking her social media entirely, not out of anger, but because I needed to stop reopening the wound. Healing cannot happen if you keep pressing on the bruise to see if it still hurts. I redirected my attention to things I had neglected, friendships I had put on hold, hobbies I had abandoned because motherhood required all of me. At first, everything felt pointless. Joy felt like betrayal. Laughter felt inappropriate. How could I enjoy myself while my child lived a life that no longer included me? Then, slowly, I began to understand something uncomfortable but necessary. My suffering was not a currency. It did not buy me redemption. It did not bring her back. It only shrank my world further, so I allowed myself small mercies, morning walks, coffee with an old friend, music I used to love before my life revolved around schedules and obligations. These moments didn't erase the grief, but they reminded me that I still existed outside of it. There were days I felt strong, days I believed I could live with this reality, and then there were days a simple memory would knock the wind out of me. A child's laugh in a grocery store, a mother and daughter arguing playfully, the ordinary things that now felt like reminders of what I had lost. I stopped asking why she had changed her name. The answer didn't matter anymore. What mattered was how completely she had changed her relationship to me. Names can be reclaimed. Silence is harder to undo. I thought about what reconciliation would even look like if it ever happened. Would I be allowed to speak? To explain? Or would I be expected to accept a version of myself that wasn't true in order to be included again? That question scared me more than the idea of permanent distance. Because love that requires self-erasure is not reconciliation, it's surrender. I began to see my own identity more clearly, not just as a mother but as a person with a history, with limits, with worth that didn't depend on anyone else's validation. That realization didn't make the loss smaller, but it made me stronger. I stopped preparing speeches in my head for a conversation that might never come. I stopped rehearsing apologies that might never be heard. I let go of the fantasy of closure delivered neatly through dialogue. Closure, I learned, is something you give yourself when the other person cannot or will not participate. And in that space, something unexpected happened. I started to feel less afraid of her choices. Not because they didn't hurt, but because I finally understood that they were not entirely about me. They were about her need to control her narrative, even if that meant simplifying the truth. That understanding didn't excuse the pain she caused, but it freed me from carrying all of it alone. and for the first time since she disappeared from my life, I stopped waiting at the door. There is a strange kind of quiet that settles in after you stop waiting. It is not peace, at least not at first. It is an emptiness where hope used to pace back and forth, restless and exhausting. Without hope, the days stretched differently, slower, heavier, more honest. In that quiet, regret began to surface in ways I hadn't expected. Not the loud, obvious regrets people imagine, but subtle ones. Moments I dismissed, words I chose for convenience instead of clarity, times I stayed silent because I believed love meant endurance. I wondered if my daughter had mistaken my restraint for indifference, if my effort to respect her independence had looked like distance. Parenting doesn't come with translations. You act with intention, but intention doesn't always survive interpretation. I replayed arguments we never finished, conversations that ended with uneasy compromises. I remembered times she accused me of not listening and how defensive I felt, even when I tried to stay calm. I asked myself whether I had truly heard her or whether I had been listening only long enough to respond. These questions didn't come from self-blame anymore. They came from curiosity, from the kind of reflection that happens when you're no longer trying to fix the past, but understand it. At the same time, I began to feel the weight of judgment from others more sharply. People love clean stories, heroes and villains, liberation and oppression. Nuance makes them uncomfortable. When I told someone about the estrangement, their reactions fell into predictable patterns. Some assumed I must have done something terrible. Others rushed to reassure me that my daughter would come around, as if this were a phase, not a fracture. Very few asked how I was actually coping. Even fewer allowed for the possibility that two things could be true at once, that she had pain and that I had loved her. I learned quickly which conversations to avoid. Not everyone deserves access to your grief. Explaining myself over and over felt like being cross-examined for a crime I didn't remember committing. Then, unexpectedly, I heard something that unsettled me. A mutual acquaintance mentioned, almost in passing, that my daughter seemed exhausted lately, that she had been struggling, though she framed it as growth, that she talked often about needing to stay strong and committed to her decisions. The words lingered with me, committed to her decisions, as if she were holding a position rather than living a truth. I recognized that tension immediately. I had lived it myself in different ways. The pressure to justify a choice after it has already been made, the fear that reconsidering would mean admitting error, the weight of an identity built on separation. When you build your strength around walking away, turning back can feel like weakness. I didn't feel relief hearing that she was struggling. That kind of pain doesn't work that way. But I did feel something shift, a crack in the image of certainty she projected, a reminder that cutting ties doesn't eliminate grief, it only relocates it. I wondered if she missed me in ways she couldn't admit, if moments of silence haunted her too, if she ever felt the absence of someone who knew her before she knew herself. There were days I felt anger then, real anger, not loud or explosive, but sharp and clear, anger at how easily I had been erased, at how my humanity had been reduced to a lesson in someone else's healing journey. That anger didn't make me cruel, it made me honest. I stopped romanticizing reconciliation. I stopped imagining emotional reunions where everything was understood at once. I began to accept that if she ever returned, it would not be with apologies neatly wrapped or explanations that made sense. If she came back, it would be carrying her own confusion. I also began to understand something about myself that surprised me. I wasn't broken by this. Scarred, yes. Changed, absolutely. But not destroyed. I was still capable of care, of empathy, of holding complexity without collapsing under it. That realization didn't remove the pain, but it gave me ground to stand on. I stopped trying to defend my version of the story to people who weren't present for it. Truth does not need an audience to exist. It only needs consistency. And I had lived mine. One afternoon, while going through old files, I found something I hadn't seen in years, a note she wrote me during a difficult time in her life. In it, she apologized for pushing me away and thanked me for not giving up on her. The irony stung. I sat there, holding that piece of paper, and felt the weight of time pressing in from both sides, past and present colliding, evidence of love existing alongside proof of distance. That was when it became clear to me. She hadn't erased me because I didn't matter. She erased me because I mattered too much, because acknowledging that would complicate the narrative she needed to survive her choices. And that understanding, painful as it was, softened something inside me. Because people don't erase what is insignificant. They erase what threatens the story they are telling themselves. Acceptance doesn't arrive with certainty. It arrives with fatigue, with the quiet realization that fighting reality takes more energy than living inside it. I didn't wake up one morning and decide to accept the distance between us. I simply ran out of ways to resist it. I stopped asking myself when she would come back. I stopped checking the calendar for dates that might matter to her. Birthdays, anniversaries, holidays passed with a muted ache instead of sharp expectation. The pain was still there, but it no longer screamed. I began to rebuild my life in small, careful ways, not because I wanted to move on, but because I needed to survive. I reorganized my home, not to erase her presence, but to make space for myself again. I donated clothes that no longer fit the person I was becoming. I rearranged rooms that had stayed the same out of habit rather than comfort. There is something symbolic about moving furniture when your life feels stuck. It reminds you that change is possible, even when it's uncomfortable. I allowed myself to imagine a future that didn't revolve around reconciliation. That was the hardest step, not because I didn't want her back, but because hope had become a fragile thing easily shattered. I needed stability more than optimism. Friends noticed the change before I did. They said I seemed steadier, quieter, but stronger. I wasn't performing resilience. I was practicing it. And then, just when the days began to feel predictable again, something happened. It wasn't dramatic. No grand apology. No sudden reappearance. Just a message, simple, unexpected. It came late in the evening when my guard was down. I almost didn't check my phone. Almost. Her name appeared on the screen. Her new name. My breath caught, not from excitement, but from fear. Fear of hope returning too quickly. Fear of disappointment. Fear of reopening something I had only just learned to live with. I didn't open it right away. I sat there, phone in my hand, feeling the weight of everything we hadn't said. I reminded myself that one message didn't undo years of silence, that I didn't owe immediate forgiveness or emotional availability. When I finally read it, the words were careful, measured, not unkind, but not warm either. She said she had been thinking about me, that she hoped I was well, that she didn't know how to bridge the distance but felt it was time to acknowledge it. No explanation, no apology, just acknowledgement. And yet, it felt monumental. I read it again and again, searching for subtext, for promises, for regret. But the message was exactly what it appeared to be. A door cracked open, not pushed wide. I didn't respond right away. That surprised me. The version of myself from months earlier would have replied instantly, heart racing, words spilling over each other, but I was different now. I understood that how I responded would set the tone for whatever came next. I had learned something important in the silence. Connection without boundaries is not healing. It's surrender. I asked myself what I wanted, not what I feared losing. I wanted honesty, mutual effort, respect, not a return to the old dynamic where I absorbed discomfort to preserve closeness. I finally replied the next day, calm, kind, honest. I told her I was glad she reached out, that I had missed her, that I was open to talking, but needed clarity and care moving forward. My hands didn't shake as I sent it. That was how I knew I had grown. What followed was slow, uneven. Messages spaced days apart, conversations that hovered near the surface, avoiding deeper truths. It was clear she was still protecting something. Still unsure whether approaching me threatened the identity she had built without me. I didn't push. For the first time, I trusted myself to walk away again if I needed to. Not because I didn't love her, but because I loved myself enough not to disappear. That balance was new, fragile, but real. I didn't know where this would lead. Reconnection is not a straight path. Sometimes it circles, sometimes it stalls, sometimes it ends differently than we hope. But I knew one thing with certainty. If we were going to find our way back to each other, It would not be through erasure. It would be through truth, and that, finally, felt like a beginning I could stand inside. The first real conversation didn't happen the way I imagined it would. There were no tears right away, no dramatic confessions. It was cautious, almost clinical, like two people testing ice to see if it would hold. We spoke about neutral things at first: work, weather, small updates, the kind of talk that pretends history isn't sitting between every sentence. I listened more than I spoke, not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to hear who she had become without me. Her voice sounded different, more guarded, more deliberate, as if she were choosing each word carefully, afraid of revealing too much. There were pauses, long ones, moments where I could feel something pressing to the surface and then retreating. I didn't rush her. Silence, I had learned, can be an invitation instead of a threat. Eventually, she mentioned how hard the last few years had been for her, how she had needed space, how she had felt overwhelmed by expectations she couldn't name at the time. She spoke in generalities, avoiding specifics, circling pain without pointing directly at it. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct her. I didn't defend myself. That restraint took more strength than any argument ever had. When she finished, she waited. I could feel it. She was bracing for something, for denial, for anger, for justification, perhaps even for guilt. What I gave her was none of those. I told her I was sorry she'd felt overwhelmed, that I wished she had felt safe enough to tell me earlier, that I had missed her deeply. And then I said something that surprised both of us. I told her that disappearing without explanation had hurt me more than any difficult conversation ever could have. The line went quiet. I didn't say it to accuse her. I said it because it was true, because pretending otherwise would have meant erasing myself again. She didn't respond right away. When she did, her voice sounded different, less certain, less composed. She said she hadn't known how to talk to me without feeling like she would collapse, that cutting contact had felt like the only way she could breathe. I understood that feeling, more than she realized. But understanding doesn't mean agreeing, and empathy doesn't require self-sacrifice. I told her I respected her need for space, but that space without communication creates wounds that don't heal on their own, that relationships don't survive on absence alone. They need effort on both sides. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I didn't plead. I spoke calmly, steadily, as someone who knew her worth. That was the moment I felt the balance shift. She wasn't holding all the power anymore. The conversation didn't end with resolution. There were no promises, no clear plan forward. But there was something new between us, a shared recognition that what had happened was bigger than a name change or a period of silence. It was a rupture, and ruptures require care, not denial. After we hung up, I sat alone for a long time, processing what had been said and what hadn't. I didn't feel elated. I didn't feel devastated. I felt grounded. I had spoken my truth without losing myself. That mattered more than any outcome. In the days that followed, I noticed how differently I held myself. I didn't check my phone obsessively. I didn't analyze every word she sent for hidden meaning. I responded when I was ready, not when I was anxious. Dignity is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It just changes how you move through the world. I began to accept that reconciliation, if it happened, would not look like a return to the past. The past was gone. What remained was the possibility of something new, built on clearer boundaries and mutual respect. And if that possibility never fully materialized, I would survive that too. Because I had already survived the worst part, the erasure. I realized then that love doesn't mean unlimited access. It doesn't mean tolerating disappearance. Love can exist alongside limits. That was a lesson I had learned too late to save what we had been, but not too late to protect what might still be. As we continued talking, I began to notice how much of her language didn't sound entirely like her. Certain phrases felt borrowed, rehearsed, words that carried certainty without vulnerability. I recognized them from articles, posts, conversations she must have absorbed in spaces where pain is explained through frameworks rather than lived through in real time. She spoke about boundaries as if they were walls rather than doors, about healing as if it required severing rather than mending, about independence as if it could only exist in opposition to connection. I didn't challenge those ideas directly. I asked questions instead. gentle ones, curious ones. I wanted to understand where her convictions came from, not dismantle them. When I asked how she had decided to change her name, she hesitated. Then she said it made her feel safer, more in control, like she could define herself without interference. I asked what interference had looked like. She struggled to answer, not because she hadn't felt constrained, but because naming it would have required specificity, and specificity complicates narratives. She spoke instead about pressure, about expectations, about feeling watched. I listened carefully, searching my memory for moments that matched her description. I found some. Times I had worried too much. Times I had advised when she wanted affirmation. Times I had spoken from fear instead of trust. I acknowledged those moments, out loud, without excuses. That surprised her. Accountability has a way of disarming defenses, but accountability only works when it is mutual. When I gently asked if she could see how cutting me off entirely had affected me, the air shifted. She grew quieter, more guarded. She said she hadn't meant to hurt me, that she assumed I would understand eventually. Understanding is often used as a substitute for consent. I told her something then that felt risky but necessary. I said that healing should not require someone else's invisibility, that if a process demands erasure, it is worth questioning. Not all pain is caused by harm. Some pain is caused by misunderstanding, misalignment, and unmet needs that were never named. She didn't respond right away. When she did, her voice was tight, controlled. She said she had been encouraged to prioritize herself above all else, that returning to old relationships felt like backsliding. There it was, the influence I had sensed. I didn't criticize the people in her life. I didn't need to. Instead, I asked her a single question. I asked whether the version of strength she was practicing left room for connection or only for survival. That question lingered between us. Over the next weeks, our conversations became more honest but also more tense. The closer we got to the truth, the more pressure she felt to defend the choices she had built her identity around. Reconsidering them would mean acknowledging harm not just experienced but inflicted. That is a difficult reckoning. I could see her standing at a crossroads. One path allowed her to keep her story intact, clean, empowered, applauded. The other required nuance, complexity, the uncomfortable admission that walking away had consequences beyond her own relief. Neither path was easy. I realized then that no amount of love from me could make that choice for her. I also realized something else. I no longer needed her to choose me in order to choose myself. That clarity was freeing. I stopped measuring our progress by how close we were getting. I started measuring it by how honest I was able to be without fear. I stopped shrinking to make reconnection possible. I allowed my full presence to exist, even if it complicated things. Some days, she pulled back again. Some days, she reached out with softness I hadn't heard in years. The inconsistency no longer destabilized me. I had learned to stand still while the relationship found its own rhythm, whatever that turned out to be. I wasn't chasing her anymore. I was meeting her where she showed up. And if she couldn't meet me there, I would not follow her into absence again. That decision didn't harden my heart, it strengthened it. Because love that survives erasure is powerful, but love that refuses to erase itself is unbreakable. The shift didn't happen during a deep conversation or a carefully planned moment. It happened in the middle of an ordinary exchange, the kind that usually passes without meaning. She mentioned something small, almost in passing, and then stopped herself. There was a pause, a hesitation I hadn't heard before. Then she said it quietly, almost reluctantly. She said she didn't know who she would be if she stopped being angry. The words landed heavy. They weren't dramatic. They weren't accusatory. They weren't even directed at me. They were an admission, one that cracked something open. I didn't respond right away. I knew better than to rush a moment like that. Truth, when it finally surfaces, needs space to breathe. She continued, her voice uneven now. She said that for a long time anger had given her clarity. It had simplified things. It had told her who was right and who was wrong, who deserved distance and who deserved protection. Without it, she felt exposed. I listened, not as someone waiting to be vindicated, but as a mother hearing her child admit fear. She said that walking away had made her feel strong at first, empowered, certain. People praised her for it. encouraged her to hold her line, to stay committed to the version of herself that didn't look back. But certainty, she admitted, had a shelf life. Over time, the story she told herself had started to feel tight, restrictive, like a costume she couldn't take off without losing approval. Every time she questioned it, she felt guilty, disloyal, weak. She said that reaching out to me had terrified her, not because she feared my reaction, but because she feared her own. She feared that if she let herself feel again, everything she had built around distance would unravel. I told her something then, gently, without urgency. I told her that anger is a bridge sometimes. It gets you across unbearable pain, but it is not meant to be a home. She cried after that, not loudly, not uncontrollably. Just enough to let me know the weight she had been carrying was finally shifting. She said she didn't know how to fix what she had broken, that she didn't know how to face the damage without collapsing under it. I told her she didn't have to fix everything at once, that accountability is not about punishment. It's about presence, about staying in the room when things get uncomfortable. I also told her something else. I told her that acknowledging harm does not erase the reasons you acted. It simply adds humanity to them. That was when she said the words I hadn't expected. She said she was sorry, not in a polished way, not with a list of explanations, just a simple, fragile apology. I didn't rush to accept it. I didn't need to. I told her I appreciated her honesty, that hearing her take responsibility mattered, that trust would take time, and that was okay. I could hear relief in her breathing, as if the weight of maintaining the old narrative had finally become too heavy to carry alone. That conversation didn't solve everything, but it changed the direction of the story, because once the narrative cracks, it cannot fully be rebuilt the same way. There is room now for complexity, for shared truth, for a relationship that doesn't rely on one person's erasure to survive. When we hung up, I sat quietly, not overwhelmed, not euphoric, just steady. For the first time, I felt like whatever came next, I could meet it without losing myself. Because reconciliation, I realized, is not about returning to who we were. It's about meeting each other honestly, as we are now. And that was enough. Time passed differently after that conversation. Not dramatically, not instantly, but subtly. The air between us shifted, lighter, though still cautious. We didn't talk every day. We didn't immediately return to old routines. But when we spoke, there was honesty, presence, recognition of what had been lost and what remained. I realized that healing is rarely loud. It doesn't arrive with fireworks or grand gestures. It comes in quiet consistency, in small acts of care repeated over time, in the patience to meet someone where they are without demanding they meet you where you were. She began to share more. Not everything, but glimpses, pieces of her life I hadn't known, her successes, her fears, her struggles, moments she had been too proud or too afraid to share before. I listened. I asked gentle questions. I offered guidance only when it was requested. I learned to balance love with respect for her independence. We laughed again, not the easy, unguarded laughter of childhood, but the tentative, fragile kind that feels like it might break if held too tightly. And yet, it held. It was proof that connection, once broken, can still find a rhythm if nurtured carefully. I began to see her in a new light, not just as my daughter, but as a person navigating the world with the tools she had, the mistakes she had made, the courage she carried. I admired her resilience, even when it had been expressed through distance. I understood the fears that had driven her choices, and I forgave, not because forgiveness erased the past, but because holding on to resentment would have kept me trapped in it. I also forgave myself. For every misstep, every moment I had feared overreaching or being too much, every time I stayed silent when I should have spoken. I forgave myself for being human, for parenting imperfectly, for loving completely, because loving completely is a risk, and risks sometimes end in pain. But they also end in growth, in understanding, in the chance for connection to return, even in new forms. There were moments that still hurt, memories of the years we lost, holidays that passed without togetherness, milestones celebrated in absence. Those memories were like old scars, visible, sometimes tender, reminders of the battles we had endured. But they no longer controlled the present. They were part of our story, not the whole story. We began to rebuild slowly, cautiously, visits that lasted longer each time, conversations that dug deeper, explored feelings we had both avoided for fear of confrontation, moments of shared vulnerability that felt like bridges, delicate but strong enough to hold, and every step forward reinforced what I had come to understand, that love is not about possession, it is about presence, about showing up fully when the other person is willing to meet you even halfway. In the process, I discovered something profound about resilience. It is not merely surviving hardship. It is learning to carry the weight of pain without letting it define your capacity to love. It is maintaining clarity about your own worth, even when others deny it. It is holding space for someone else's growth without sacrificing your own. My daughter's name change, her years of silence, her distance, they had all been part of her journey. And they had been part of mine. I had learned patience, I had learned dignity, I had learned that connection is a two-way street, and that sometimes the greatest act of love is waiting, observing, and loving without demand. We were different people now. Our relationship would never return to the unexamined innocence of childhood, but it had evolved into something rarer, something intentional, something chosen, not assumed. We had reclaimed what had been lost, not by erasing the past, but by acknowledging it fully. And in that acknowledgement we found freedom. Freedom from blame. Freedom from expectation. Freedom to love again without the fear that every gesture would be rejected. Freedom to exist together without erasing one another. I often think about how this story could have ended. How easy it would have been to let resentment fester, to let silence become permanent. How tempting it was to define the narrative as irreparable. But life rarely rewards rigidity. It rewards persistence, patience, and the courage to stay present even when the outcome is uncertain. Now, when I see her smile or hear her voice, I feel something deep and unshakable, not relief, not triumph, not victory, something quieter, stronger. The knowledge that love, even when tested to its limits, can endure, that people, even when they turn away, can turn back. That forgiveness, patience, and empathy are never wasted. Our journey is far from over. There are still moments of tension, moments of doubt, moments when the past whispers insistently, but those moments no longer define us. They remind us of how far we have come, how much we have survived, and how capable we are of building something lasting, honest, and meaningful. And in that, I have found peace. A peace born not from perfection, but from perseverance. Not from erasure, but from enduring love. Not from forgetting, but from choosing to move forward together, fully seen, fully known, fully loved.